Andrew Parker Bowles is now 86 years old, and there he is, relaxing in his home in Wiltshire with a leather-bound journal that has been gathering dust for nearly 30 years. It's honestly hard to believe he's finally sharing why he left his marriage to Camilla, especially since what he's revealing has very little to do with the story we all heard back in 1995. For 3 decades, we've been fed a neatly wrapped package of events. The image presented was of a retired army officer stepping aside graciously so his wife could be with the future king. He was painted as the understanding ex-husband, the guy who knew his place, who conveniently vanished from the story to allow the royal romance to unfold without any awkwardness. But once you peel back the layers and look at the behind-the-scenes reality, the documents, the timelines, the meetings, the clean narrative completely disintegrates. What we're really seeing is a calculated move by the institution to silence a man who had too much information, and the cost of his silence turned out to be nearly everything he possessed. Let's dive into this, because the timeline is truly something else. In January 1995, Andrew found himself in a London law office, and he wasn't alone. The room was filled with important palace courtiers and legal advisors, and right there in front of him were divorce papers that included a non-disclosure clause designed to keep him quiet for the rest of his life. By this point, the public narrative was already established. Earlier that year, Charles had openly confessed to cheating, which left Andrew looking like the world's most humiliated husband. Most people thought he was simply clearing the way for the new couple, hoping for a quiet thank you from the palace, and maybe a financial arrangement to ensure his comfort moving forward. But the internal records from that time tell a very different story. The pressure Andrew faced was anything but subtle. Rather than flattering him or dangling money, the courtiers targeted what really mattered to him, his loyalty to the military and his children. Reading through the details, it feels less like a prediction and more like a blueprint for what would unfold if he didn't play ball. They made it clear that if he pushed back on the divorce or unveiled the real timeline of Charles and Camilla's relationship, things would get incredibly messy for the entire royal family. We're talking depositions, financial inspections, and sworn testimonies, all while putting the line of succession at risk. Andrew Parker Bowles, who had dedicated his entire career to serving the crown with the Blues and Royals, held a prestigious role as Silver Stick in waiting to Queen Elizabeth II. He knew the stakes and understood the gravity of what was being asked of him. Ultimately, he signed the papers, deciding to take on the role of the villain, the guy who couldn't keep his wife, the one who turned a blind eye, the husband who just let everything unfold around him. What really hits hard is the impact of that choice on his everyday life. He couldn't defend his honor to his peers, and explaining the truth to friends wasn't an option. He found himself walking through London with the media shadowing his every step, all the while putting on a brave face as headlines branded him a failure. There's this moment I remember from a regimental dinner back in November 1997. Fellow officers actually skirted around his table, unsure whether to express sympathy or simply look away. Despite everything, Andrew Parker Bowles held his military stance and chose to remain silent, never uttering a word of defense. The palace got what it was, after a clean and quiet separation, shifting the focus from an institutional scandal to a faltering marriage. But the price of that silence, the real human cost he endured, walking away with nothing and saying nothing for decades, is what's captured in that leather-bound journal. And here's where things take a turn to the financial side, because rumors were swirling all around. People thought Andrew Parker Bowles walked away with a hefty payout, with newspapers suggesting multi-million-pound settlements. The buzz around London was that Charles had dipped into his Duchy of Cornwall reserves to ensure Andrew's cooperation. It made sense at the time. Why else would someone just vanish without a trace? So Andrew Parker Bowles ended up with absolutely nothing when he divorced Camilla. He didn't take a single penny from Charles, even though the palace's legal teams offered him the usual financial packages. Instead, he chose to walk away with just his military pension. It's honestly hard to believe he made such a bold move. They had to sell Middlewick House, their beautiful estate in Wiltshire, to pay off the mortgages and debts that had piled up during the messy end of their marriage. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Andrew wanted his kids, Tom and Laura, to look back at the divorce documents and know their dad wasn't just selling their mother out to a future king. He turned down financial security just so the family wouldn't appear as though they were part of a business deal. But that empty bank account wasn't just a story of sacrifice. It hinted at something much deeper going on behind the scenes. While Charles didn't directly pay Andrew off, there was a rather powerful figure lurking in the shadows. Lord Goodman, a notorious and feared legal fixer in London, had been quietly working in Wiltshire using a fake name since late 1994. His role wasn't to represent the Prince of Wales or even Queen Elizabeth. He was actually acting on behalf of a secretive group of influential politicians and royal advisors. They were pretty worried about the monarchy's financial stability, to say the least. They figured that if Andrew contested the divorce based on Charles's long-term cheating, it could lead to a court demanding a complete audit of the Duchy of Cornwall's private accounts. This audit would have laid bare the royal family's hidden riches at a time when the British public was struggling financially. It would have shown how much money was quietly flowing into Charles's pockets from tenant farmers, while everyday citizens were wrestling with their taxes. Lord Goodman made it clear that a public trial could spark total chaos for the monarchy. The risk was so high that they might lose their entire sovereign grant. So, in the end, Andrew was left with a choice that really wasn't a choice at all: to keep quiet. So, here's the deal with Andrew Parker Bowles. Instead of taking the blame or just grabbing a modest army pension, he decided to go for a fair settlement, which meant risking a whole lot, including the institution he'd taken an oath to defend. In the end, he picked the army pension. As he watched the removal truck pull away from Middlewick House, he knew he had managed to save the crown billions while basically sacrificing his own financial future. Once the files were closed and the house was sold, the public bought into the whole golden handshake story. Palace officials thought they had it all figured out and marked his name off their risk assessment lists, thinking the financial threat was neutralized. But the money issues were just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The real problem, which they had created themselves, was that a military man with no assets and a broken home has nothing left to lose. The palace operatives, whom Andrew liked to call the Grey Men, realized something crucial. He still had his military clearance codes, personal diaries, and connections in the intelligence community. They had successfully forced him out of his family home, but had unwittingly turned him into an independent operator who was well acquainted with every royal residence around. By the summer of 1995, Andrew had settled into a tiny rented flat in London. His uniform was still sharp as ever, but his life had taken a drastic turn. He started spending his afternoons at the library of the United Oxford and Cambridge University Club, scribbling in small blue notebooks with detailed timelines. He was tracking when royal protection officers were reassigned from his own detail to cover Charles's private meetings with Camilla. This wasn't just a random project. He was building a defense file, not for a court, but for his own survival. Palace security caught on to his new routine pretty quickly. They realized that kicking him out of Middlewick House hadn't crushed his spirit. All it did was take him out of their sight. A broke brigadier nursing a grievance was actually a threat to the royal image makeover they were planning for Camilla. Then, in August 1995, Andrew received a private letter at his club from someone in the palace. The letter laid out a secured future for his children, weighing Tom's jump into publishing and Laura's art career against Andrew's continued silence. The shadow over his property was anything but simple. There's a fascinating story that really changed how Andrew Parker Bowles saw his life, and it all goes back to May 1991 at the badminton horse trials. Picture this. The rain is pouring against the hospitality tent, and inside, you've got that familiar mix of damp wool, wet earth, and fancy champagne flowing for the usual crowd of aristocrats and military folks. Andrew was hanging out near the back exit, gin and tonic in hand, just surveying the scene when suddenly the atmosphere shifted. A hush swept through the tent. Everyone's attention turned as Princess Diana walked in, flanked by her protection officers. She didn't bother chatting with the event organizers, but made a beeline right to the corner where Andrew was standing all alone. Meanwhile, outside, the press was stuck behind barriers, their long camera lenses all fogged up from the torrential rain. For a full 3 minutes, the most photographed woman in the world stood just inches away from Andrew, the husband of her husband's mistress. Diana was calm. She didn't raise her voice or get upset. Instead, she leaned in close and whispered something that completely changed everything for him. She revealed that both of them were being seen as pieces on a chessboard by some shadowy figures at Buckingham Palace. Diana had the guts to tell him that his phones were being tapped, not for the usual scandal catching, but to keep tabs on what he knew about the relationship between Charles and Camilla. She locked eyes with him and explained that the palace had already decided their marriages were basically collateral damage in whatever larger plan was unfolding. The whole machinery of the state was gearing up to eliminate both her and Andrew from the royal picture entirely. Now, most people might hear something like that and think it's just paranoia, or they'd rush to tell the press. But Andrew didn't do either of those things. That very evening, he went back to his quarters at the Household Cavalry Barracks in London. With his military clearance in hand, he quietly launched an investigation into the security measures surrounding his home. And within just 48 hours, an intel contact confirmed everything Diana had warned him about. His suspicions proved to be true. There was a shocking moment when Andrew Parker Bowles discovered a surveillance device hidden inside the telephone junction box outside his home in Wiltshire. It was actively recording every conversation he had with his kids, every order he gave to his officers, and even every argument with Camilla. Learning that all of this was being transcribed for some high-level committee left him feeling utterly betrayed. He had dedicated his life to serving the realm, faced danger in Northern Ireland, and navigated tricky colonial assignments, always believing in the honor of his duty and the sanctity of his oath to the Queen. To find out that the very state he served was treating him like some sort of enemy was a betrayal that stung far more than his wife's infidelity. Andrew realized he wasn't just battling a love rival, he was up against a massive corporate entity that saw his dignity as a threat to its global image. The tension truly peaked one day in July 1992 during a private polo match at Cirencester Park. Charles was on the home team while Andrew was officiating from the royal box. After the final whistle, he caught Charles in the changing rooms for a quick, no-nonsense chat. There was no mention of Camilla, no demands for an apology regarding his family's humiliation. Instead, he placed a handwritten list of the surveillance states right next to Charles's gear and laid down an ultimatum. He insisted that the spying stop immediately, or he would disclose the whole situation in his upcoming retirement speech to the international press. Charles looked pale upon hearing this, but didn't deny or defend the surveillance. He simply stated that he had no control over what the security services were up to regarding constitutional protection. Then he left the room without even picking up the paper. However, just 48 hours later, the surveillance device quietly disappeared from the wall, exactly as it had come. While Andrew had managed to neutralize this immediate threat, he was acutely aware that his win was only a temporary one. Andrew Parker Bowles found himself in a really sticky situation, feeling like a pawn in a game he couldn't quite control. The palace had started to see him as a wild card, someone who was sharp and strategic, but also held serious evidence of dark dealings against a British citizen. On June 29, 1994, he was just sitting in his armchair, watching Charles spill his secrets of infidelity to millions of viewers on national television. It was like the palace had orchestrated this moment from the get-go, crafting the broadcast schedule months in advance to put Andrew in an awkward spot where he had to respond publicly. With the world watching, it seemed almost impossible for Andrew to maintain his marriage without looking totally like he was in on the whole thing. The focus shifted to this messy love triangle and all the scandal that came with it, diverting everyone's attention away from the serious intelligence reports and the hidden files tucked away in his desk. As he watched the screen, he started to see the trap for what it was. Staying would make him a laughingstock, but fighting back would mark him as a traitor. It was as if the palace had cleverly used the media to do what they couldn't achieve through intimidation alone. They had cut him off from his comrades, neutralized his military clout, and prepped the public for what was inevitably coming. Weeks later, he received a nondescript brown envelope at his London club, and when he opened it, he found an unredacted copy of the BBC's broadcasting schedule for that quarter, alongside internal memos from the palace press office dated 6 months before that tell-all interview. It became painfully clear that the televised confession hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment revelation from Charles, but rather a well-planned maneuver by the palace to engineer Andrew's departure while he was still in uniform. He carefully packed those scheduling documents into a small leather briefcase with his private logs. He knew making any bold moves could lead to a court-martial under the Official Secrets Act. The palace had been smart enough to cover their tracks, utilizing national security laws to shield themselves, but inside that briefcase was one little slip-up they'd missed. It was a receipt for a courier service that had delivered a package from the cabinet office to Camilla's address right before the incident where Diana's warnings came to light. With that heavy realization, Andrew locked up the case, understanding that this betrayal went way beyond just a moment in time. It was a calculated move that changed everything. It all starts with this pretty dark chapter in history, marked by the Hyde Park bombing. On the 20th of July, 1982, the scene was chaotic shrapnel and shattered glass everywhere on South Carriage Drive. That day, smoke was rising from a household cavalry escort vehicle, and the lingering scent of gunpowder and burning metal filled the air. The tragedy claimed the lives of 4 soldiers and 7 horses from the Blues and Royals, thanks to a nail bomb planted by the Irish Republican Army during a routine changing of the guard. Andrew Parker Bowles, who was a commanding officer at the time, rushed to the scene just 4 minutes after the explosion. His uniform was stained with blood as he worked to rescue survivors from the wreckage and helped coordinate the military's emergency response. People regarded him as a pillar of strength in the regiment's darkest hour, yet the very files generated from this heartbreaking incident would come back to haunt him years later. They compiled the grim details into a hefty blue government folder known as Operation Ironclad. For 2 decades, those documents remained hidden away in a secured basement at the Ministry of Defense, kept under wraps by a 40-year secrecy rule. The official report inside documented the security failures that allowed the terrorist group to track the cavalry's movements. Fast forward to 1993, when things were really tense between Charles and Camilla. A duplicate of that folder landed on Sir Michael Peate's desk. He was the financial guy behind the royal family's overhaul. But they weren't digging into military history. Oh no, they were hunting for a weak spot that could sway a principled officer. The atmosphere shifted during a meeting at the Cavalry and Guards Club in October of 1993. Instead of presenting a divorce proposal or any legal documents, Sir Michael Peate pulled out just a single page from the Operation Ironclad files. This particular document revealed that a young officer under Andrew's command had flagged a suspicious vehicle at the Hyde Park perimeter 3 days before the bombing. Sadly, that crucial warning had gotten lost in all the administrative paperwork at the barracks, and as the commanding officer, Andrew Parker Bowles bore the legal consequences of that slip-up. Sir Michael looked him in the eye and made it all crystal clear. The palace had a clear threat in mind. If the public ever caught wind that the regiment ignored a direct warning, it would tarnish the reputations of the fallen men. Not only that, but the regiment itself could be dragged into a public inquiry. They were prepared to twist the narrative of the Hyde Park bombing to paint Andrew Parker Bowles as negligent, which would ruin his military legacy and dishonor the Blues and Royals. Andrew knew that the backlog in administration was really due to a shortage of staff ordered by the government, not his own misstep. Still, he was well aware that the British press wouldn't bother to dig into the complex details of military logistics and would run with whatever sensational headline they could find. It was as if the palace was determined to break him down. He had weathered the loss of his wife and home, but he couldn't let the memories of his fallen soldiers get pulled into a public relations shambles over a royal divorce. As he strolled through Green Park toward his quarters, he didn't reach out to his lawyers or seek advice from friends. He understood that he was trapped, with his loyalty being used against him. If he went along with the quiet divorce timeline, the secret documents from Operation Ironclad would remain hidden in a secure basement, out of public sight. On the flip side, if he pushed back, those files could easily end up in a Sunday tabloid through an anonymous leak from a government department. It felt as if the palace was weaponizing a national tragedy to secure a quiet resolution to their domestic issues. But here's where Andrew's military training came into play. While putting together his personal papers for retirement in 1994, he stumbled upon a significant mistake made by the palace officials. Sir Michael Peate had inadvertently left a photocopy of the Operation Ironclad extract on a table at the Cavalry and Guards Club, and Andrew had the foresight to slip it into his pocket. The back of that page had a digital timestamp showing when it was printed from a cabinet office terminal on the very morning Charles had given the green light for his upcoming TV interview. The two operations were like puzzle pieces connected by that same digital footprint. Andrew securely locked the time-stamped photocopy in his locker at the Household Cavalry headquarters. While he had no plans to use it as leverage against the future king, it certainly served as a valuable insurance policy for him. In February 1996, Andrew Parker Bowles tied the knot at the Chelsea Register office, dressed in a simple gray suit instead of his usual military gear. Standing beside him was Rosemary Pittman, holding a small bundle of winter flowers. The whole event felt incredibly low-key, with no royal photographers in sight and just a few close friends there to witness the moment. It was exactly 1 year since his divorce from Camilla had been finalized. The media jumped on the story, labeling it as a typical rebound, just an aging bachelor finding some companionship after a public split. But honestly, that timeline was way more about strategy than romance. In October 1995, Andrew had a lunch at the Turf Club with Mark Shand, Camilla's brother. This wasn't just a casual catch-up. Mark came with a message straight from Highgrove House. The Prince of Wales wanted to make sure that Andrew's new marriage wouldn't stir up unwanted attention on the past. Charles needed Andrew to settle into a calm, quiet life before they could start introducing Camilla as his official partner. There was a lot riding on this arrangement, especially concerning Andrew's kids. Tom was 21 and Laura was 17, both at an age where palace politics could seriously impact their social lives. Mark made it clear, if Andrew stayed a bitter single divorcee, he'd be an easy target for the press to critique Charles and Camilla. But if he remarried quietly, the whole storyline could fade away, and his kids would benefit with direct access to the prince's circle. As an added incentive, Charles even offered to cover Tom's university costs. Andrew Parker Bowles made a big decision at the Turf Club table when he agreed to maintain a public facade of happiness for the sake of his children's futures. This strategy was all part of what the palace planners hoped for. It turned out to be pretty effective, too. His son, Tom Parker Bowles, went on to become a well-known food writer, often backed by royal connections, with Charles even stepping in as his godfather. Meanwhile, their daughter Laura managed to navigate the London art scene effectively, ensuring that her social life remained intact despite her parents' split. Andrew essentially traded his own public image to secure a stable life for his kids, making sure they wouldn't be shut out from the world they belonged to. But there was a deeper reason behind his willingness to play the part of the supportive husband, one that lay tucked away in a medical file at King Edward VII Hospital. In November 1994, just before the divorce papers were signed, he went through a routine military, physical, and that's when doctors discovered a serious cardiovascular issue that needed immediate, risky surgery. The prognosis was grim. They doubted he'd even make it to the new millennium. He kept all of this to himself, not letting even his closest colleagues or the public know. This diagnosis flipped everything on its head for him regarding the divorce. He realized that if he passed away while still married to Camilla, she would find herself inheriting only his modest military pension, alongside a heap of debts from Middlewick House. Faced with that reality, he knew she'd be financially precarious and socially cut off, especially given that the prince couldn't marry a divorced woman under church law back then. So, Andrew didn't step aside because he stopped caring about his family. He did it because he thought he might be dying, wanting to ensure Charles would take on the financial responsibilities for Camilla's well-being after he was gone. That's the part that completely changes the story. He wasn't just a husband who gave up. He was a man with a terminal diagnosis, making a calculated move to secure his family's future. As it turned out, Andrew survived the surgery, defying those dire predictions. In 1994, he was around to witness the dawn of the new millennium and even attended Charles and Camilla's wedding in 2005 at the Windsor Guildhall. As a guest sitting in the pews, he watched the woman who once shared his name take her place next to the future king. Reporters at the event saw his presence as a sign of modern aristocratic maturity, thinking it symbolized a civilized resolution to an old scandal. What they didn't realize was that his attendance marked the final check-off on a 10-year-old palace agreement. He sat there, fully aware that he had successfully directed everyone to their respective roles. His children were taken care of. His ex-wife was safeguarded by the wealth that came with the Duchy of Cornwall, and his own medical issues remained confidential. After the ceremony, as guests made their way to the reception at Windsor Castle, Andrew Parker Bowles walked back to his car alone. He had met every condition outlined in the unwritten contract. But little did he know, his survival would soon take an unexpected twist. He had outlived the diagnosis that had once dictated his decisions, yet the palace had one last surprise role for him in the new reign. Fast forward to late 2025, and there he was, standing in the marble hallway of Westminster Abbey during a state event, adjusting the medals on his chest from his military service in Rhodesia and Northern Ireland. As the television cameras swept by, they honed in on the center aisle where Queen Camilla walked beside King Charles, capturing every detail for millions watching at home. Andrew stood off to the side, just another face in the crowd of dignitaries, overlooked by the lenses that once followed his family's every move. Official records from the Lord Chamberlain's office laid out his exact spot at these grand events. While he was always listed on the guest registers, his seat consistently found itself several rows behind the working royals. He received the usual formal invitations, thanks to his status as a retired brigadier and his historical connections to the court. Yet, the palace seating arrangements were meticulously crafted, ensuring he remained in the background. It's honestly hard to believe how carefully the institution manages the space between Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla. They keep an eye on him, making sure he stays out of sight during public events so that there's a clear distance between her past and her present. This became really clear during a private reception at St. James's Palace in early 2026. Andrew, having once been the commander of the household cavalry, was sitting at a table with some senior military folks. When Camilla entered, greeting everyone with her private secretary by her side, her team smoothly redirected her away from Andrew, who was just a few yards away, guiding her towards the foreign attaches instead. It was like a well-rehearsed dance, completely unnoticed by the rest of the guests. This little maneuver highlights the ongoing conditions of Andrew's long-standing relationship with the crown, which has lasted for about 30 years. After surviving heart surgery in 1994, he outlived his second wife, Rosemary, who passed away in 2010. Now he leads a quieter life in his village in Wiltshire, watching from behind his locked gates as his children, Tom and Laura, enjoy high-profile dinners at the palace as the stepchildren of the king. Andrew has stayed true to all his promises made back in 1995, never writing a memoir, never selling a quote, and never attempting to set the record straight against tabloid stories that labeled him as a failure. Yet, the real enigma of his current situation lies in a small blue identity card given to him by the Royal Parks Administration. This card allows Andrew unrestricted access to the private grounds of Hyde Park Barracks whenever he wants, day or night, a privilege not often granted to retired officers who've been out of active command for over 30 years. It's not just a casual perk connected to retirement benefits. Interestingly, security logs show that he uses this pass at least once a month, usually showing up after dark when the horses are settled in their stalls. Wandering through the stables, he chats quietly with young troopers and checks on the tack rooms. Meanwhile, the palace security team keeps a close watch on him, logging exactly when he comes and goes, tracking his movements through the military compound with their cameras. They certainly know he's not there to cause any trouble. Andrew Parker Bowles has made some significant sacrifices in his life, giving up not just his home but also his career and reputation, all to safeguard his family and the stability of the British crown. It's honestly hard to believe he chose a quiet life of dignity instead of diving into the chaos of the multi-million-pound media frenzy. At the age of 86, with his leather-bound journal spread open in front of him, he still holds crucial royal secrets. There he is, walking through the stables after dark, checking on the horses, staying true to every promise he made to an institution that needed him to take on the role of the villain for the sake of the crown. The lingering thought now isn't really about why he stepped away, but rather how he managed to keep silence for 40 long years, while the truth waited patiently in that journal, just waiting for the right moment to be shared.